Watch Dogs Legion lacks an identity. That's a pretty damning criticism to level at a game that allows you to play as any NPC, but it's unfortunately the truth. The marketing force behind this game did their jobs well, as the promise of building a team of everyday people to save a city with was enough to lure me in, despite the fact that I've never been an Ubisoft enthusiast. And never has this been more true than now, given the fairly recent accusations of mental and sexual abuse lobbied against the company that led many higher-ups to step down. Abusing power in any way towards workers is inexcusable, and so naturally, the company isn't getting any good faith points from me. It's hard to say how much of an impact this had on the quality of games being released. All I can do is judge the game for what it is, and as a product, Watch Dogs Legion is mediocre. I give kudos and well wishes to the people who worked through the hellish conditions to get this game done, but I can't refrain from making my issues with this title evident. This version of London is boring, stagnant, and lifeless, as it lacks the same flair of many of its open-world contemporaries. The writing and voice acting is hokey and laughable, which deflates an already unengaging and drab story even further. The narrative is hard to keep pace with, as you hardly ever meet permanent characters who will make their presence felt, as instead, storytelling is done through data transfers and downloads. It correlates with the hacker gameplay, but it lacks any character beats, making the experience as heartless and as soulless as the machines you'll spend hours of your life hacking just to complete this game. And I might as well add the word spineless into the mix, given that this game boldly claims to be apolitical and not inspired by any real-world events, despite the ever-growing comparisons that can be drawn between it and the digital era we live in. I've never dabbled into the previous two games, but from what I can tell, the promise of being a hacking legend capable of bringing a city to its knees still hasn't come to full fruition even 3 games in. And perhaps the most damning, the game pointed to the ability to play as any NPC as its defining trait, the thing that it would live or die on. And for the most part, it died on it. I'd like to take some time now to share my more detailed thoughts on Watch Dogs Legion, but I have an important disclaimer to share with you first. I fully intended to complete this game and review it fully, but I ended up being a victim of the System Software 8.01 update bug that bricked a few people's consoles. I had to reset my PlayStation 4 Pro to factory settings, and unfortunately, my save data for Watch Dogs was the only thing I lost. I would have had no problem completing this game, as even an average title can be worth seeing through to the end. But after losing all of my data, I cannot bring myself to restart it. It's not good enough for that. Maybe someday, but not right now. Because of this, I don't have a complete picture of the game in its entirety, but I was about 15 hours in and completed a healthy balance of main missions and side missions. So with that, I present my impressions of Watch Dogs Legion. Watch Dogs Legion immediately throws us into the shoes of a man on a mission, a local DedSec operative who's attempting to snub a potential terrorist attack on the city of London. The game will tell you his name is Daniel or Dalton or something like that, but it's not important. He won't be around for long. He's being guided by Sabine, the leader of DedSec's London operation, and she is important. However, the game's approach to characters is so lackadaisical that I couldn't even remember her name and I had to look it up. They are aided by the only character's name who is easily remembered, Bagley, and he isn't even human. He's an advanced AI system with a tendency for sarcasm that was stolen and repurposed by DedSec. And he's the only character on the player's side who brings any life to this game. The mission seems to be going well until Dalton is confronted by a hologram of a terrorist who outlines his zero-day plan. The unidentified person claims that this will be London's day of reckoning and that a new era will soon be established. With that, 3 massive explosions occur throughout London, no doubt killing many. In the days and months following the attacks, DedSec is falsely accused of being the terrorists responsible and have no choice but to disband and rebuild their ranks by inspiring the locals to join their cause. Meanwhile, a militaristic security force named Albion is contracted by the government to monitor all of London and keep things safe. With this, the premise of the game is set, finding out who was behind the zero-day attacks and rebuilding DedSec, all while clearing their names. It's a good enough premise to justify this game's main promise, the ability to build a specialized team of everyday folks who can be controlled interchangeably from mission to mission. It was the feature that perked my ears up and had me interested to learn more throughout this game's marketing cycle. And after seeing that grandma infiltrate a fortified base at E3 a couple years back, I, like many others, was sold. It was an idea unlike anything that I had experienced before. The people I had spent years running over in vehicles without a second thought would now become the heroes. After years of taking abuse from playable characters, the NPCs would finally get a chance to shine. A whole city of Londoners, all with different abilities and traits and gear and flaws available to complete missions with however you saw fit. It promised the player freedom and the possibility of endless experimentation. It was an intriguing idea that had real potential to revolutionize the industry. But unfortunately, this fascinating idea was implemented in the most basic way possible. You start by selecting a fresh recruit from a list. They all have different faces, ethnicities, and backgrounds, and it's an awesome step towards inclusion in games. I won't be all negative about this system. I'm willing to give credit where credit is due. Throughout my experience with the game, I never once saw a repeated character model. They all had a unique identity in terms of their physical appearance, at least in their faces. If you were hoping to play as a plus-size person, you won't be given the opportunity to do so, as apparently no one in London is overweight. You'll also notice a lot of repeated voice actors who are shared across multiple characters. The copy and paste voice work is only made worse by the try-hard and cringe-inducing writing that so desperately wants to appeal to youth culture.
Fuck yeah! Need more hench peeps not afraid to take up the fight.
Hell yes! I'm ready to get my hands dirty with you lot.
Fucking banger.
Liberally throwing around F-bombs and trendy words like fam doesn't instantly make your team members as edgy as the game writers believe it does. It feels disconnected from reality. Take this scene here, where the player must use one of their women team members to seduce another woman for information. Like I said just a few minutes ago, I'm all for inclusion in games, and I have no problem with gay or lesbian characters. But earlier this year, I played The Last of Us Part 2, which handles a relationship between two women so perfectly by defining it with human characteristics and human conflicts instead of sexualizing it and fixating on the fact that it's between two people of the same sex. It felt natural and respectable. Here though, Watch Dogs Legion treats a connection between two women very grossly. The women say maybe a total of 7 poorly written lines to each other before immediately opting to have sex with each other. It feels straight out of a bad porn scene. It feels disingenuous, grimy, and disrespectful from my perspective, especially considering the recent allegations against Ubisoft. it's not great, and the poor writing doesn't help either. The game is so jam-packed with this obnoxious writing style that you better play with subtitles on if you're over the age of 20, or else you might not be able to keep up, especially if you struggle to comprehend British accents. Of course, if the entirety of the story is anything like the 15 or so hours I experienced, you won't really have much of an incentive to follow along with the narrative anyway, regardless of its poor writing. Because your team is made up of a lady you hardly ever see, a computer AI, and a random series of professionals, pencil pushers, blue-collar workers, and degenerates, there isn't much room for impactful character beats. The story can never make anything impactful happen to the character you're currently playing as, because who's to say they are any more important than anyone else on your team? They all talk and act the same way. Whatever the plot demands of them is what they do, regardless of their backgrounds. From a storytelling perspective, they are all interchangeable clones with no unique personalities who will spew out their cringe-inducing dialogue as soon as the script demands it, like a puppet and a puppet master. And nowhere was this more apparent than in my favorite section of the game. You're hunting down the location of a woman who's found a way to code the human consciousness into computers, making them immortal in her view. You first learn about this woman in an awesome sequence, and you quickly come to view her as a villain. It was fascinating, and it held my interest for the hour or so it took to complete this thread of quests. The only off-putting part was that I played this mission with a character that I had literally just recruited off the street. And he already knew so much about DedSec, this lady named Sky Larson, and the Zero Day Mystery, even though he literally just joined our ranks. He didn't skip a beat, despite being fresh meat, and it got the cognitive dissonance brewing in my mind. The identity of any person on your team is not relevant when it comes to story sections, leaving the bulk of that work to fall to the villains. London has 4 bigwigs tied to Zero Day: Albion's leader Nick Cass, local head mobster Maria Kelly, Bloom genius Sky Larson, and Emily Child, the leader of a local security force. Credit where credit is due. They make for some pretty interesting bad guys, all who incentivize you to take them down by being scumbags. You don't get a whole lot of interaction with them, but they do steal the show when they make their appearances. And if the game's story does improve further, past what I've seen, it will surely be on the backs of these characters, alongside of any twists and turns that accompany them. So, if playing as anyone you see doesn't have a strong impact on the narrative, then it has to make up for that in the gameplay department. To put it bluntly, the game doesn't do enough to differentiate between each character using the trait system, meaning that everyone ends up playing the same way. Every NPC has a few modifications falling under traits, gear, and flaws. These involve things like faster hacking speeds, the ability to get items for cheaper, access to unique weaponry and drones, and even negative effects like slower walking speeds or hiccups that alert enemies. Ubisoft made a list of these sorts of qualifiers and randomly assigned them to every NPC, with a few unique ones thrown in for good measure, such as the Beekeeper, who has an army of electronic bee drones. As you scan the streets of London, you'll quickly realize that many folks have identical abilities, or that they won't be super useful to your team. The game will go out of its way to gift you better team members by completing missions or highlighting them on the map. This makes identifying top-level recruits much easier, but I'm glad that they don't restrict you into using these superior people only. Sure, you're incentivized to, but you're not forced to, meaning that if you want to challenge yourself, or even just roleplay a bit, you can. And the inclusion of a permadeath mode makes things even more interesting, and if I ever revisit this title, that will be how I play. But like I said, this trait system doesn't do enough to make each person feel unique. I understand that we're working within the confines of a video game, and simulating genuine differences between hundreds of people is a tall task. But when your marketing team paints that picture, it becomes harder for the player to stomach what we got. Ultimately, most every mission you play, whether it's part of the main story or side content, plays out exactly the same. You approach enemy turf, you preview things using your cameras or drones, and then you sneak in using your physical body or a spider drone in order to hack or download some data. Seriously, every mission seems to involve this loop without much variation in level design or enemy behaviors, making things repetitive. It also doesn't help that enemy locations are recycled throughout the side content, meaning you might visit the same place multiple times. I mean, I visited this hospital 4 times in 15 hours, and I think that's a little ridiculous. So regardless of whatever traits your character has, most missions will still play out the same way. Now, some perks do switch things up, but only in minor ways. For example, occasionally, a character might gain access into hostile territory because of their profession and the accompanying attire. And you can also spend tech points on a very limited number of weaponry and hacks that can be equipped onto each character to give just a little bit more variety, but not much. The only thing that drastically changed up how I approached a mission was when the target was on a rooftop. Meet Toff Vanterpool, my construction worker who had access to a cargo drone. I cannot tell you how many times I cheesed missions simply by flying in his Toff, completing the objective, and flying out while undetected. He became my de facto character simply because this cargo drone proved to be so effective in so many instances. This skill proved invaluable and had me playing as him more than anyone else. It almost felt a little too powerful, but I'm not gonna call it bad design, maybe just a little imbalanced. Missions can never require specificity within them because they can't ensure that a player will have someone with the necessary skill set on their team to complete whatever that variation is. It means every mission is designed to be cookie cutter so that any character is capable of finishing the task. Because of this, missions never feel memorable from a gameplay perspective, and none of your characters are allowed moments to feel special in. Every character is capable of taking out enemies, hacking spider bots, drones, and cameras, and solving these insufferable puzzles that the game insists on spamming. And rarely did I ever feel like the hacking was anything to write home about, as you can't accomplish much with it outside of reconnaissance. The game banks on its hacking mechanics and its play as anyone mantra to carry it through to the end, and neither end up being anything more than average. Outside of main missions, there are a few other types of content to engage with, although most of them either play out exactly like main missions or function as minigames. Every time you want to recruit a new person to your team, you have to first complete a mission for them. But there's only a handful of them, so don't be surprised to encounter repetition. And completing these recruitment missions doesn't do enough to make you believe that a person would immediately pledge their loyalty to DedSec, and at the same time, they also just serve as a barricade to adding people to your team. So it's not that great if you ask me. There's also liberation missions where you inspire the people of London to rebel against Albion by first completing generic mission archetypes before it culminates with a unique mission. These were some of the best missions in the game, and they rewarded you with a bossed up character to add to your team, which was nice. There's also some faction-based side content that you can complete, but I didn't get a chance to engage with it much. Oh, and you can deliver parcels in this game, I think, but I never did it. If I wanted to be a delivery boy, I'd just play Death Stranding again. A much better game than this. There's also a few mini-games to uncover and play throughout the city, most notable of which was a series of street fights. These fights were okay, if not a bit repetitive, but what disappointed me most was that it didn't culminate with anything spectacular. There were 5 fight locations to complete, and after you do that, that's it. It just ends with nothing else happening, not even a trophy pop. And I just want to reiterate this, that the final thing that struck me as odd was that your team of everyday people will have no qualms about joining DedSec as soon as you help them one time. There's an undeniable goofy feeling when you think that everyday people, like a man working as a translator or a woman working as a professional dancer, are capable of instantly becoming gifted hackers with no issue killing and maiming people in high-stakes combat. It's another case where the cognitive dissonance can sneak up on you in a hurry if you're unable to keep it at bay. So what we have is a roster of vanilla characters with no defining personalities, a gameplay loop with little variation despite the promise of it, and a basic whodunit plot that doesn't grip the player. So what's left to hold the game up? Perhaps it's the setting. London is one of the most important cities in the world and had a lot of potential in this game, particularly given its global importance and battle-tested history. In Watch Dogs Legion, London is in an occupied state after the terrorist attacks of Zero Day ravaged the city. Unfortunately, you rarely ever feel the stress the city is under despite all the patrol cars, checkpoints, and drones. It feels like life is pretty much normal in the city as these additions end up being not much more than flavoring. I rarely had any run-ins with Albion forces on the streets, and never saw my wanted meter rise above 2 stars. And the drones can easily be hacked to disable them, making them the most minor of inconveniences. So neither of these have the intended impact. And neither do the various protests that you stumble upon, as they just come off as lifeless and quite boring. Citizens roaming the streets just feel like zombies who never interact with each other or have dynamic interactions. They just wander around, waiting to be recruited to DedSec, leaving the city to feel lifeless and contrived. And not even the music can give the game a shot in the arm. In Grand Theft Auto V, I loved the radio, and switching between different music genres as I drove the streets and highways of Los Santos. Here though, I often found myself turning the music off, as it was repetitive and didn't offer enough variety for me to find something that I enjoyed. Nothing in this version of London feels alive or dynamic, and when you pair that up with the bland color palette and the uninspired look of the city, you're left with a setting that will bore you, not excite you. Watch Dogs Legion is a vanilla experience that doesn't do anything particularly well. Its promise of a series worth of hacking innovations and having a whole city of London at your disposal both fell flat. The repetitive mission structure doesn't offer many opportunities for player expression and experimentation. The narrative is bog standard with very little character development or impact. The writing style will make you feel uncomfortable and awkward as it desperately clings to identify as realistic dialogue. And the setting it all takes place in won't do anything to stand out amongst its contemporaries. With all that being said though, Watch Dogs Legion isn't a bad game. It's about as average an experience that I've had in this medium. It came in hot, with ambitious promises, but ended up stumbling along the way before breaking its fall somewhere in the realm of mediocrity. You can let me play as anyone I want, but if this doesn't result in any interesting character beats or gameplay moments, then I'm afraid that all you're left with is a case of missing identity. Hey guys, if you enjoyed this look at Watch Dogs Legion, consider checking out some of my other reviews on the channel, including long looks at Ghost of Tsushima and The Last of Us Part 2, alongside of some shorter reviews like of Animal Crossing, The Outer Worlds, Crash 4, and Final Fantasy VII Remake. Thank you so much for watching. Please leave a like if you enjoyed the video, consider subscribing for more, follow me over on Twitter at NopeNapNarp, and as always, have a nice day, and take care.